anybody who married his progeny or anybody related to him and whatsoever was in public service. That's a pretty good record.
I think you told me that John F. Kennedy was the closest thing to royalty.
Well, that's in the book. You got to read the book.
All right. Well, that
We
takes
can
away my
tease
next.
him a little bit.
That takes away my next question about John F. Kennedy.
Bob,
But
John F. Kennedy was, of all the people I met, and I met a lot of people, you know, including Archbishop Makarios and Willy Brandt in Germany and the different people, high people in Russia. But John F. Kennedy was the most impressive person I ever met. He was an Irish prince, an Irish-American prince, and he knew it and he liked it. He enjoyed being himself, and he was happy. And he was one of those people. If you looked at the X-rays of his back, he had the worst back of any living person in the world. You know, the X-rays were just terrible. But he was also born with something some people are born with. He had a high tolerance for pain, so the pain in his back, it didn't bother him most of the time, and he was able to enjoy life. But he did. But he was such a wonderful. He inspired me whenever I saw him, and it's in the book. I describe him in detail from his head to his toes, and what he did and what he stood for. And he was a man of principle. There were certain things he would never violate, and I admired him.
You know, David, something that's not in the book that I was thinking about is that when Frank was appointed Attorney General, it was on his 37th birthday. The governor of Michigan was 36. The mayor of Detroit was 33. The president of the United States was 44. And now we're facing a presidential campaign where many of the leading candidates may have to use walkers for the debate. So we've really that's really changed. Why do you account for that? Why do we have so much an older class?
I think that's one reason I want to motivate people in the public service. When I was young, which is a long time ago, but some of our people are old enough to remember it. When you were in college dormitory and you're sitting around and have the bull session every night, there were only two subjects, women and politics. And after you exhausted the subject of women, then you got into politics, and you talked politics for hours. And that was every college I ever visited or ever saw. That was it. And all of a sudden, now if you go to a college, they still talk about women, but no politics. What has happened is that the anti-government types have convinced people with term limits and other distracting things. They've convinced a lot of people that the government is their enemy. Now, how they ever get to that reasoning is beyond me. The government is your enemy, and the politics is a dirty, dirty thing. You don't want to be in it, you know. And they've convinced the average young person that they don't want to be in it. And so very few young people aspire to get into politics anymore because they think that the government is a big problem, and it's not worth trying to solve, and all this sort of thing. And it's just the opposite of the way I was raised, the way I was educated. And until we get young, idealistic men and women back into politics, we're going to continue to have the mess we have, both Washington and locally, of extremists just arguing for argument's sake and not make progress. And we should be more progressive and be accomplishing more, as we used to at one time.
when you became Attorney General, there was another young person there, and she's here tonight. Her name's Pat Anderson, your longtime assistant, both as Attorney General and at Kelley Cawthorn, and probably still to this day. Pat, can you stand up for a minute, please, and be recognized? And Pat may have a question or a comment, but I'll start. Was she your secretary the first day you became Attorney General?
No. First day I became Attorney General was my predecessor was Paul Adams, and he was a good friend of mine, a great guy, former mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, but very well educated, very sophisticated, graduate of the University of Michigan, and we became good friends because one of the things I had going for me, being a young lawyer in Alpena, my partner and I were the only Democrats in the county. And you know, it's isolated over here in northeastern Michigan. So any Democrat that drove to Alpena to campaign, by the time he got there, he had to use the bathroom, you know. And so my bathroom was the most popular bathroom in Michigan for Democrats. So they all stopped there, G. Miller Williams, Phil Hart, Pat McNamara. I got to know them all. And It was wonderful. What was the question?
Well, I want to know, was Pat Anderson your first assistant at the Attorney General's office in 1970?
Paul Adams had a very nice lady, but she was old enough to be my grandmother. And so I didn't think that was a good way to start. And so I put the word out. I said, I want a young secretary that's got a very good disposition, and hopefully she knows shorthand, you know. And the word came back within 4 hours that it had to be Pat Anderson. Pat Anderson went to Alma, and she studied shorthand at the college level, and she was very easy to get along with. And it must have worked out all right, because she's been with me for 55 years.
Yes, Pat.
And she's going off probation next year.
What's that? Yeah, she still calls him Mr. Kelley, too. And you should also. You know, one thing that isn't really in the book, Mr. Kelley, and I know it about you, is your love of show business and all things Hollywood. And could you talk a little bit about that? And did any of that account for your showmanship in politics or your mastery of communicating with the public?
Well, I had a conflict when I was young. And in school, I was, you know how they pick you out in second or third grade, the teachers. They'll think you got certain talents, whether you do or not. Well, I was pushed into dramatics in grade school. I think it was by the nuns originally. And then I was made the reader. For the first to the third grade, I was the class reader. And I would go to the office and read on the loudspeaker system the first 3 grades, one chapter of the Bobbsey Twins. So that made me a ham actor right off the bat, third grade. Then from the 3rd grade through the 7th grade, I read one chapter of Nancy Drew or the Tom Swift and the Magic Camera, one chapter of that. Then the nuns put me in, I was the lead in the grade school play. Then I was the lead in the junior high school play. And then I was the lead in the senior high school play. And I was in dramatics at college. And so I thought with it, because my dad's background, the people I'd met, well, my dad, Jack said about my dad's place in Detroit. Babe Ruth came there every day. I mean, Jack Dempsey, I was around celebrities as a little kid all my life. And so what I wanted, my dad wanted to be a lawyer, but I wanted to be a lawyer and a theatrical agent. Because I wanted to be like Mark McCormick that would handle Arnold Palmer out of wherever he was, Chicago or what. He handled Arnold Palmer. And because I always felt there was a need for somebody honest to manage talent, you know, actors and athletes, whoever it is, boxers, and so on. Handle them honestly, take care of them, and make sure they don't die poor and all that. That was a great field, and I wanted to do that. And my dad wouldn't let me. He said, no, you got to go into public service. So what I used to do, Kelley Keenan is here. He used to be my administrative assistant years ago. And as soon as the campaign was over, my latent desire to be an actor, I'd be right out to Hollywood. And I'd be looking up Lou Wasserman and all the big shots in Hollywood. And it was okay, because as long as you had a big political office, they wanted to hear about politics. Well, you heard about show business, you know. So I'd go to Lou Wasserman, the most powerful guy in the country, and in order to satiate my ego, I'd say, you know, I'm not in that work anymore, and I've thought about doing it. But yeah, Lou, would you have hired me as an agent, you know? And Lou Wasserman, the famous agent, I would have hired you in a minute. No, I walked out of there on cloud 9. And so I always had an interest in showbiz, because that was my second application. And as a result, I went to Hollywood and New York, and the Niederlander family in Detroit, Bobby Niederlander, they own theaters in New York. And through my friendship with them, I met all kinds of stage actors. And through Steve Allen, I met people. And I did. Jimmy Durante, believe it or not. How many people remember Jimmy Durante? He was a buddy of mine, believe it or not. He was my buddy. He called me once a week. My secretary can testify to it. And
Who was Mrs. Calabash?
yeah, I think it was his wife. I think it was his wife. I'm pretty sure it was his wife. But anyway, he was such a sweet guy. And what happened was Steve Allen and I split up after about 20 years. When Steve was young, he was a very radical guy, you know, a member of the Trotskyite Socialist Party or something, you know. And we went to school together, and he had all these ideas, and I had some of them, but not too many of them. Anyway, then he got to be very successful, you know, at the first Tonight Show, and he made all kinds of money. And he did one of those neurotic reverses, you know. And he went from being a radical to being an extreme conservative, you know. And a lot of communists do that. You know, I can't think of their names right now, but different communists in the 40s, they would quit the Communist Party and they'd go right over and become a staunch Catholic. They had to be in a regimented organization, but it was conservative for them. And they would all wind up being over in the Catholic Church. So believe it or not, when I ran for United States Senate in 1972, I wrote Steve Allen. He wrote me back a 2-page letter telling me 15 reasons why he couldn't help me because he was a conservative. And I was kind of brokenhearted. And guess what? They mentioned it at some golf club in California, and Jimmy Durante heard about it. He called me up. So that's Steve Allen. He says, what I'm going to do, he says, I'm going to, and he was in Hollywood, 70 years old. He says, I'm going to stop in Vegas, pick up my trio, come to Detroit and raise you some money. He flew to Detroit, put on a fundraiser for me, and raised me $78,000, which is like $780,000 today. And then I tried to pay for his hotel room and everything. Wouldn't pay anything. I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. And I met people like that, you know. And it was wonderful. It was a lot of fun. So I have had a happy life.
You know, Jack.
It's all in the book.
Oh, it's all in the book. So let me ask Jack a question. A lot of times we say there's no more statesmen, there's no more Frank Kelleys, and maybe there's systemic reasons, but in some ways Mr. Kelley seems like the product of a very specific pre-World War II American experience. You know, the speakeasies and lying about his age to work on the Great Lakes as a merchant marine, and the ferries, going to the desert as a young college student, and almost was barely out of the territory phase in Arizona. I mean, can there be another Frank Kelley, or is he really a product of a time and place that's gone?
Well, I think yes and no. I think that he's more the product of he's sort of, you know, his life spans almost a century, 3/4 of the 20th century. And he started at a time when, of course, there was still some of the, as you say, the atmosphere of the frontier. But politically, I think he was shaped by the post-World War II era of consensus. Politics stops at the water's edge. You fight to a certain extent, but you've got the state and the national good at heart. And, you know, there are a lot of folks back there, both parties. Frank Kelley, of course, Governor Milliken, Governor Romney. And, of course, things are different now. But I wouldn't be so quick to say, you know, and I have to watch myself because I'm now officially in the OF status myself. And, you know, it's easy for Arizona, it was better back in 1980. It wasn't all better. And I think there are some young people who are promising today. My own personal view of watching this process is that term limits has been very detrimental to the development of long political careers. I think most of us know that. But you know what? There was a Russian poet and writer named Ilya Ehrenberg, and he had one of his poems. He said, if you cover the whole world with asphalt, in that asphalt a crack would appear, and in that crack grass would grow. So as long as people are willing to try to make this a better world, the way Frank did, I think there's always hope. Just think if I had, quite apart from politics, if we were sitting here 12 years ago, and I said, the next president of the United States will be a black guy with an African name whose father's a Muslim from Kenya, you would have wanted to have me committed. But it happened, didn't it? So I don't think we should be too quick to rule out that somebody else, like Frank, could appear on the scene.
Speaking of elections and surprises, you know, Mr. Kelley, you always ran ahead of the ticket, even in years when Democrats suffered big losses, whether it's 62, John Swainson, 66, Soapy Williams, 90, Jim Blanchard, your protege. Why is it that even in bad Democratic years where they suffered losses at the top of the ticket, you were able to run ahead?
I knew I'd write another book.
You must have some idea.
The main, well, I think, I don't want to brag here. Ethnic bragging I'm not into, really. But it doesn't hurt to be an Irish American and have a name like Kennedy or Kelley. It is a little help, you know, because people go in and they don't know from zilch, and they see a name that sounds pretty good to them, and they kind of trust it. And so I did have an advantage, I have a good name to start with. And then I tried never to do anything to besmirch it. And I think I always try to make people like me. And I learned it in Alpena, but get this. My partner and I, John Mack, may he rest in peace, we were the only Democrats in the county, lawyers. There were 19 lawyers, except for your dad, came later. But anyway, there were 19 lawyers, 17 were Republican. And I was in this town, and I wound up, after I had my first case was to get a criminal sexual psychopath out of jail in a small town. Very popular move on my part. So that was my first case, and I sprung him because he was innocent. I got 2 of the top psychiatrists in Michigan to testify. He was no more a sexual psychopath than the man on the moon. He later went on to Anchorage, Alaska, wound up living a wonderful life and never did anything wrong. There was nothing wrong with him. He was railroaded by people who wanted to take his assets. So I won that case, and I won a couple other controversial cases. So I'm there about 18 months, and you get a knock on the door. In comes the Republican mayor and council, and I said, what do I owe this visit? He said, well, we've been doing a little thinking, Frank. I said, yeah, what did you conclude? They said, well, we've been thinking, we want to hire you as city attorney. I said, you can't hire me as city attorney. It wouldn't look good. I'm a Democrat, and you're all guys are all Republicans and so on. And they said, no, we've been giving that thought too. I said, you did? What was your conclusion there? They said, you take care of the law and advise us on the law. We'll take care of the politics. We'll get along just fine. And we did, you know. And then I had a nice law practice, and only one thing about it. All my clients were Republican, every single one. So I learned up there that, you know, you can be partisan now and feel it, but you can still make good friends amongst everybody. And one of my dad's favorite lines that he taught me as a youngster is, if you get any idea that I get ideas from my father, I got a lot of them from my father because I loved him. But this one line was, any damn fool can make enemies. It takes a smart person to make and keep friends. And now I know he was right because his funeral procession was 2 miles long. So I wish I could make friends like my father, but that's true.
Let me add a little something to that, because I might even be in a slightly better position to answer it because I'm outside of his skin. I've been observing him for a long time. When Frank retired, finally voluntarily retired, the Detroit Free Press had a long editorial which it noted that what was most remarkable was he was in that office for 37 years without any hint of corruption. I think people knew that. They knew whether they agreed with him or not, that he was a man without guile, an honest man. And also, once when, you know, every 4 years the poor Republicans had to nominate somebody to run against Frank Kelley. It was their turn of the barrel. And once Frank ran into one of these guys on the campaign trail. And Frank said, smiled, shook his hand and said, I want to wish you luck, but just remember, I'm a million handshakes ahead of you.
Mr. Kelley, what do you consider the greatest crisis you faced as Attorney General, whether it was a political scandal in some other part of government, or natural disaster, or civil disturbance?
Well, you know, it's like asking a doctor who's had all kinds of cases, you know, what was your most serious case? There's no one, you know, there is no one. But I mean, I was attorney for the Constitutional Convention. I was attorney for the big argument, and I argued in the Supreme Court of the United States in Michigan about apportionment. You know, and when I became Attorney General, there was 256,000 people had a senator in Detroit, and 80,000 people up north had the same senator.
They had the size of the district.
Yeah, the size. They had 80,000 people in the district, plus they counted 1 million trees, I think. It was 1 million, and so some people were outrepresented 2, 3 to 1. That was big. Apportionment, it was big, and